Welcome to Data Science Perspectives. This series focuses on analytics and data science professionals from across industry to learn about how their career unfolded, what skills they look for when hiring, and what trends they think are coming next. I'm your host, Bill Franks. Let's get to it. Welcome to this episode of Data Science Perspectives. I'm your host, Bill Franks. Today's guest is Chris Miller. Chris and I go all the way back to graduate school, where we were in the same class together, and it's been great to see his career progress over the years. Chris decided to go into the pharmaceuticals R&D straight out of school, which was one of the major paths available to us at that point in time, and he's since spent almost his entire career with AstraZeneca. Chris is currently the VP of Biometrics for Respiratory Immunology and also Statistical Innovation at AstraZeneca. Over his 30 plus years, he's held approximately 10 different roles, starting from principal statistician and working his way up to his current position. Impressively, Chris was one of the first non-PhD employees to break into senior roles on the clinical side of the business. His first job out of school was with Abbott Labs. He has an undergraduate degree in math from Loyola University of Maryland and a master's degree in statistics from North Carolina State University. And with that, let's welcome Chris to the show. Well, thanks for joining me on the show today, Chris.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to be here.
So the question I like to start everybody out with is, what initially drew you into the world of analytics and data science way back in the day?
Thanks. Yeah, it's kind of funny because initially my aspiration was to be a physician. I was really interested in a career in healthcare, but I found that I was really good in math. So I majored in math in undergrad, and that led to a concentration in statistics and then grad school in statistics, and kind of feel like I ended up in the best of both worlds as a career with biostatistics and data science in the healthcare field.
You'll know this directly since we were literally in school together. So I remember when each of us decided first not to get a PhD, everyone told us that was a mistake, and then to go into business. I think you got a little bit of forgiveness because pharmaceuticals was accepted business, but for me, people thought I was absolutely crazy to go to AT&T, just a generic business. Isn't it? I guess if you remember that, isn't it amazing how far it's come since then? When people looked askance at you for even considering doing what we did.
Yeah, really extraordinary. And I remember at the time I was just hungry to get into it and solve real world problems and kind of get away from book studying.
Yeah, well, you ended up then you went to AstraZeneca. Well, you initially went to Abbott Labs, but then shortly thereafter, in a couple of years, to AstraZeneca, and you've ended up staying both in the industry and then with one specific company for multiple decades now, which is not common. So, what have you enjoyed so much about the work you've been doing to have such a long tenure in an industry and a company?
Yeah, it's kind of funny when I joined Abbott Labs right out of grad school, and that was a great company to start my career and kind of felt like a really good, strong foundation in how to do drug development and biostatistics. I left there after a couple of years for a couple of reasons. One was location. So my family was from the East Coast, and I kind of was longing to get back close to an ocean and more temperate climates. But the big driver was um, my first company was a little too structured for me, and I really wanted to explore different areas of quantitative sciences I could contribute. So I joined Zeneca shortly after it became a company in 1993 and have been there for 31 years, mainly because the environment allows me to get involved in all kinds of different areas of drug development that require quantifying decision making. So it's really kind of afforded me a lot of flexibility and a lot of ability to explore what I can contribute.
So you just said something I'm not sure I realized. You said Zeneca when it started. So because I just think of it as a big company these days. Are you saying that you joined it when it was in startup mode?
Yeah, so when I joined in 93, that was the beginning of the period of big chemical companies divesting their pharmaceutical business, just because
Mm.
the business model of developing drugs and making paint was different. So that happened. Zeneca came from a demerger of ICI, which owns Glidden Paint, and you saw the
Okay.
same thing happen with DuPont and DuPont Merck. Yeah, so when I joined Zeneca, it was shortly after the demerger, and there were, a couple hundred people working in clinical
Hmm.
development, and we had no products. So to me, it was
Wow.
like joining a startup or biotech, and then it's grown over 30 years into, a big player in big pharma.
That's what I get. I never knew that little point of history because I guess back all those years ago, to me, it was just a pharmaceutical company that I didn't know a lot about when you went there. But that's amazing. I'm sure you've seen a ton then evolve, and not specifically at Zeneca and then AstraZeneca, but in the industry in terms of the data, the methods used, the data sources available, and such. What have been some of the biggest changes and advances that you've seen since you first got into it?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things I've seen, and it's the same as what we've seen in our personal lives, it's the ability for fast and small computing and the accessibility of that. So when I first started, there was no internet. Computing was through a mainframe. So it was very difficult for anyone to access and manipulate and work with data. So it was very rarefied territory to be able to do any sort of computing, and computing was slow. So I remember joining before there were um, graphical user interfaces
Yeah,
and before you could display a graph on a terminal, right? So I'd do some coding to try to produce a plot, and I'd send it to the printer, and it'd be available tomorrow. And you go show up tomorrow and say, "Oh gosh, that's not what I wanted. That line is not right. The axis is wrong," and you do it again. So the speed of computing, the accessibility of computing, and with that, the accessibility to data. And not only different types of data, but different jobs, different roles being able to access the data. So, I work in a cross functional team. And when I first started, a physician would not be able to directly access data. Everything was a request through me to do something. Now everybody's looking at the data, but again, very similar to your personal life, how you can access your banking data or flight data to arrange a trip.
and so I guess with the change in all of that data access, the volume of it's also changed. So if I recall back in the day when you started, that's when clinical trials, a lot of the detailed clinical trials still might only be a couple thousand people, but I mean you were limited in even the amount. Even if you could collect some of the data, it was hard to analyze it. I'm assuming today you're probably all but overwhelmed even with all kinds of real world data that's getting merged in, and population statistics and various other pieces of information that you can now enhance your internal data with, correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and it's created a new problem. So not only like dealing with the volume of it, but from a statistical perspective and decision making perspective, really thinking about what is the data you need. So what is the decision at hand? What's going to influence it, and not be distracted by extraneous things. Because it used to be data was so expensive and slow to collect. We were very careful and very lean in data collection, so the experiments were really focused. Now there's data hitting you from every angle. So I think it really requires a bit more thoughtful and purposeful approach to making inferences and understanding what the data are telling us.
So what's been recent, over time this has all evolved. What are one or two things that more recently have come into play in terms of either available data or methods that you think have huge potential for moving the industry forward?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is Bayesian statistics. So, we learned Bayes' theorem in grad school, and we'd work it on paper and figure out how to do it. Up until about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was not practical to implement a lot of that methodology just because the computing power was not there. Now it's a piece of cake. And I think along with that comes the ability to run very large simulations very quickly. Um, and That's an interesting thing because the availability of that computing power runs the risk of us getting a little bit sloppy, where some things can be solved analytically by first principle, or you could just simulate it and have the simulations tell you what you think the answer is. So we're a little careful to not over model and simulate at the expense of forgetting about some of the first principles about how to solve some problems.
Yeah, I find it interesting how a lot of the classic statistics and so forth still underpin even the most modern of methods, right? So when you go into some of these large language models and neural nets and so forth, a lot of the, when you hear the terms activation functions and such in the neurons, and you look at a lot of those, and there's some of your basic stats 101 functions embedded under there. Now, of course, they're being applied in a whole new, novel way, but it's just still amazing to me how some of those classic statistical distributions and functions are a huge component even of the most sophisticated methods today.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that. I sometimes get worried about things being a little too much in a black box. And we like to pick into that a bit and say, okay, that's really just logistic regression, maybe. You're trying to figure out what's predicting that. So it's something we think about and we're careful to understand to make sure what is underpinning it, and we should still understand the basics and understand distributions, and it's only when you do that can you understand what might go wrong and be able to spot that.
Well, if we're going to talk about black boxes and some of this stuff, that obviously brings up AI. How do you see AI being adopted and having an impact within the pharmaceutical industry, either already today or what you think will be coming soon in the future?
Yeah, so we're looking at AI on a few different levels. I actually have a goal for every person in my department this year to come up with 3 use cases of how you're using AI in your daily job. So that's kind of like ChatGPT, and we have an internal version of that we can run in a safe way without divulging confidential information. And that can be for writing an email, especially because we work in a very multinational environment where we have a lot of people where English is not their first language. So it's like, well, use ChatGPT to help you with an email and craft it for the tone and audience you want. I think kind of on a broader enterprise scale, AI is used pretty intensively in the very early stages of drug discovery, and that's where you have a lot of data, a lot of unknowns. You're not really sure what's driving different diseases, and you're trying to understand what the targets might be and what molecules might hit those targets. So really like millions and millions of data points, a lot of unknowns. So you kind of don't know what the true model is, and you're just looking for AI to give you patterns in the data.
So would that be a scenario where we kind of talk about models can be used for description or prediction? That's more of the descriptive. In other words, you're not looking for an AI model that deploy in some sense. What you're really looking for is, can the AI find a pattern or two that says, oh, this looks to be an important correlation between two things. You go, oh wow, that's a great idea. And given that AI found that, then you can go do more targeted testing to see if that relationship holds true.
That's exactly it. So really kind of hypothesis generating
Okay.
in the face of massive data sets and massive uncertainty. Yep. And then
Well,
maybe the
let's.
last bit that we're looking at is kind of on the operational side. So in late stage drug development, it's still a very sequential process where we collect data, we lock data sets, um, we create these analysis data sets in a very rigid, structured form, analyze it, write up reports, and that's all like a series of handovers that takes weeks and months to generate. We're looking at agentic AI now to look at, can we have AI agents doing those various roles? And as they see more and more examples of this, can we begin to do that as a simultaneous process? Whereas the last patient generates the last data point, we can simultaneously create all of those submission documents and analyses for health authorities worldwide. So that's probably the future that we're looking at. That I think it's surely going to happen. We just don't know exactly when and which technology is going to be the one that makes it hit.
Well, that's an amazing example. So what you end up doing then is you're not just saving people time in terms of a lot of the report work has been done by the AI, so you don't have to do it, but you're saving time on the calendar basis, meaning that you're getting this report also virtually instantaneously versus days, weeks, or months later after all the other people have the time to do all of their work.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep.
Man, that's amazing. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. What would you have any tips for folks who are listening in around what you think it takes to develop a long-term career at a single company, just based on your experience? Like, what are some of the things you felt that you had to either look out for or pursue in order to make an environment last for you that long?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think about that a lot. Um, I once had a boss who had us describe ourselves as different animals and the behavior of animals, and I figured out that in some ways I am a fox, and a fox has this combination of patience where you kind of wait for your time, you look and understand the environment, but then when you find an opportunity, you pounce on it with great purpose. So certainly being in a company for 31 years, you have some periods that are downtimes, and I think it's important to not overreact to downtimes and kind of try to have a long-term perspective and recognize that much of life, much of careers, you have downtimes, uptimes. When the opportunity comes, make sure you know what good looks like, be able to have the skills and the relationships and the knowledge on how to make yourself present and say, hey, I think I can contribute here. I think this is a good opportunity, and kind of raise your hand, step up, and seize those opportunities. Yeah, so patience, perseverance combined with the ability to pounce on the opportunities when they come.
I think that's good advice. I know from my own background, when I was really young in my career, once or twice I think I aired a little bit too much on because I mean there was so much opportunity back then. If the job's annoying you a little bit and a few things pissed you off, well, I'll just go get another job. But then, when I spent 14 years with my longest tenure, I think I was able to do a little more what you're talking about. There's some times where you're either a little bit bored or you're a little bit overstressed, and you just got to think through. Okay, this isn't going to last forever, but on the back end of it, what would I like to do? What would I like to change? And once you know everybody and you know the organization, you can help make that change happen by just planting that seed with your boss and with your team and so forth, and kind of guide yourself to where you want to go. I think if you take that ownership, it can be very, very helpful versus just sitting back.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. And in there, you mentioned the relationships. And if you have a trusted network, you have a lot of ability to affect change. And that's harder to get if you're job hunting, job jumping every year or so. You don't have those trusted relationships that you can leverage when they're needed for you.
Yeah, well. So you've mentioned about sticking it through and laying some of the plans. What do you think if you had to look at it outside of what you've already mentioned, or a trait or two that you have that you think has most allowed you to achieve the success that you have achieved?
Yes, I think maybe one thing I undervalued or underestimated when I was in grad school and getting book smart is the ability to connect with other people, build relationships, listen, so understand what is it that they need, and being able to kind of connect and sell my abilities to match their needs. I remember one example. This is years ago, but it led to a big cross-functional promotion that I got. That I had an office that happened to be next to a senior vice president in clinical, so much more senior position than me. And I connected with this person just over baseball. So we'd have a
Hmm.
coffee every Friday and talk about what's going on with baseball. And he was a Phillies fan, I was an Orioles fan. So he didn't really know what I could do technically, but he thought, oh, Chris is a pretty good guy, knows about baseball, can have a good conversation, maybe a little more extroverted than the average statistician. So we built this relationship again, just over, small talk. Uh, One day on a Friday afternoon, it was like 4 o'clock, and most people had left for the weekend, and I was plugging away, just wrapping some stuff up. He came by and goes, Chris, can you do me a favor? I'm like, sure, sure. What's up, Rick? And he goes, can you go down to the end of the hallway and just sit in this meeting for me? I've got to go to a doctor's appointment. I'm not sure if I'm going to be back. Just sit there and, represent design thinking, right? So a big idea. Like, okay. It's like, no problem, Rick. So I go down there, go in this room, open a door. I'm like, holy moly, it's all like executive vice presidents and like, the C-suite is in there. And I go in, they didn't know who I was, and we're talking, and they're talking about stuff that I could contribute to. So I began to express my opinion. The meeting ended up going on and on. I call my wife. It's like 8 p.m. on a Friday. I'm like, I guess I'm not coming home for dinner tonight. I'm not sure what's going on. And then at the end of the meeting, they're like, okay, Chris, so you need to fly to Sweden tomorrow because we're reorganizing the company on Monday, and we want you to contribute to negotiation with the trade unions about how we're shifting jobs and roles. And I'm like, okay, like I think I have a passport, just, but and it turned out that turned into a different job. I became chief of staff for the head of clinical development for a few years, just based on that random network trust I had built in someone. And then, as I think back, when Rick asked me, Chris, will you go down sit in that room? I could have said no. I could have said no. I'm going home to dinner.
Yeah.
But I said yes. And if I had said no, that would have been okay. But he never would have asked again, and I
Yeah.
never would have known what would have happened. So that was like kind of a crazy serendipitous thing. But I think it's, don't underestimate the value of those little relationships you make, especially with people who are more senior than you.
I'll tell you, and it's so critical. The funny thing is now that you're at that, one of those more senior people in the room that young guy might come into, and I've been there. Uh, People at those levels take notice too. If you come in and hang and are able to contribute and do contribute, I mean, they're going to love it, and they're going to give you an opportunity like you got. In fact, I know there's a woman I remember that super impressed me the first time I interacted with her. This is probably 10 years ago. And I remember thinking to myself, man, she's going to go somewhere. And so I put in a good word for her a few times when we were still at the same organization. I just saw on LinkedIn earlier this week, she's now some super high level position somewhere. And I'm like, yep, of course she is. Right.
Yeah,
Because I could see it. I could see it in her, even though she was, relatively new at that point. So that's an
yeah,
amazing story you had there.
yeah. And with your story, you remember that 10 years in the future. It's incredible.
Yeah. So probably someone remembers, I remember this time this young guy, Chris, comes in the meeting out of nowhere. We don't know who he is. And next thing you know, he had some great ideas and we had him go help us out in Sweden. Like you've probably had left, as much as that meeting left an impression on you, they were probably stunned in a way that
Yeah,
somehow you came in and did that. Like, no, that was just totally unexpected, but it's, to your point, if you hadn't laid the groundwork for it, the opportunity never would have come. And if you have loved your Fox analogy, if you hadn't pounced on that opportunity, you would never have known what you missed, and you might have still been plugging away in that office next to the SVP instead of becoming the VP.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
So let's talk about today a little bit. Having been here, so been in your career long enough, obviously priorities change, focus points change. What if you wake up today and you look at your calendar? What would be on your calendar where you're actually most energized for the day? Like what are your main motivating factors today uh, on the job?
Yeah, so the coolest part of my job is I sit on the portfolio review committee that our CEO chairs, and we meet once or twice a week, and we go over our portfolio of drug projects, and that's where we figure out what are we investing in, and we make some really big investments. And I'm honored to sit on that committee because it shows that our CEO and our company values statistician, data science, analytics for decision making. And it's really got me to think about what is the essence of my job. And to me, it's around decision making, quantifying risks, opportunities, trade offs, options. And so it's probably the most exciting and nerve wracking part of my job. So it's the one where I've got to be
Yeah.
the most on.
Yeah.
But I like it the most because I feel like I'm really contributing, not only personally, but I think it's so important for our discipline and people who train in math, statistics, data science, that big companies can appreciate the value we provide and that other people can't do it like we can. So I hold it really precious that every time I'm there, I want to say something intelligent and make a big contribution, so that that privilege is not taken away from me and future statisticians in that position.
Oh, that's awesome. I don't think you've ever I never knew that you were contributing in that way. And to your point, yeah, these investments at the pharmaceutical uh, organization, those investments, I mean, I'm guessing a small investment would be 10 or 20 million. Some of these are going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
That's right. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe let's turn a little bit towards students or folks early in their career. What would be a piece of advice that you'd give to them if they were looking, let's say someone a brand new hire comes in straight out of school in a junior role on your team. Like, what's your advice to them and what they should be focusing on in those early years?
Yeah, a few things. One is don't box yourself in. So, you'll join a company, you'll have a job, you'll have a role, but think more broadly again, what is the essence of what you're doing? So I mentioned with my job, it's about decision making and enabling decision making. And so when you don't box yourself in, what you'll do is you'll begin to see that there are problems adjacent to your job that might be falling between the chairs, falling through the cracks. Jump on those, contribute, say, hey, I'm not exactly assigned to that, but I think I can help there. So when you see stuff that could be better, don't complain about it. Say, hey, I think I can help there. Um, and then the second is don't be too worried about the future, whether that's the next promotion, the next job, because nobody knows, right? So, do a good job, know your craft, look at the problems adjacent to your job, think about what good looks like in 3 to 5 year time frame, but don't stress if you don't know what your job's going to be like in 20 years because nobody knows the answer to that. It's probably a job that hasn't been invented yet with a technology that hasn't been invented yet. So, dream about it, but don't obsess and stress about that.
I think that's a great point because I can say in my own career, if you look backwards in hindsight, I can connect all the dots and it all makes sense. And I can see, you'd say, oh, that was a natural flow. But if you went at any point in that career, the future was very unclear and non obvious at all. And so, to your point, sometimes an opportunity came and I jumped on it. In retrospect, it makes sense that I did and that it would lead to the next thing after that. But at the time, it was just an opportunity that came out of nowhere at that point, and I had no idea if that was going to pay off or not. I had no idea it was going to lead to that next thing. And
Yeah.
so I think that being aware and unbothered by the fact that you don't know where you're going to be in 10 or 20 years because you can't know and you'll never know. Even at this point, you and I couldn't hardly say what we'd be doing in 5 years. We might have a guess, but we'll probably be wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right that, if you share your career story retrospectively, someone say, "Oh my gosh, Bill, you're a genius. You knew all
Yeah.
this." And you're like, "No." It's like me. It's like, "No, I just went down the hall to sit in this room. I had, no
Yeah.
idea it was going to be this job."
Well, I'll tell you what, I've taken enough of your time today. But I so much appreciate you talking with me and giving some great advice. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Bill. Always a pleasure.